Welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are connected now. Please, first of all, be aware that we are recording, so you will be able to find the recording on Human Rights to Water YouTube channel later. Thank you for joining us today to continue the Actor of Change workshop series. I am Noémie Plumier, a member of the World Youth Parliament for Water, based in France, and I will be the moderator. This workshop is hosted in collaboration with the World Youth Parliament for Water, International Secretary of Water, and Human Rights to Water. Today, we will be discussing a legal and policy-based youth perspective on the human rights to water and sanitation. Imanol will give us a 40-minute presentation on today's topic. To continue, Wasif will comment within 5 minutes, which finally will let us with a 10-minute Q&A session, and we will try to finish on time, of course. I would like to welcome our two speakers, Imanol Aguilera, a legal officer at Human Rights to Water, and Wasif Bashir Babar, WASH researcher and professional, founder of the Pakistan Youth Parliament for Water. Let me introduce you our first speaker, Imanol Aguilera, a young Spanish and Uruguayan professional born and raised in Geneva region. He is a legal researcher specialized in international water law and human rights. Through his academic and professional experiences, Imanol has developed extensive skills in the areas of human rights advocacy, legal research and mapping, and capacity building. Now, Imanol, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noémie, for the introduction, and a big thanks to everyone joining the workshop today. So before starting my presentation, I would like to congratulate the World Youth Parliament for Water and the International Secretariat of Water for their precious work and for providing opportunities for young people to continue raising awareness about the human rights to water and sanitation. So I think part of the solution to the challenges the world is facing in terms of access to water, sanitation, and hygiene is to create spaces such as these for sharing perspectives and points of views that are often left unheard. So it is a pleasure for me to be part of these joint efforts and to be giving the opportunity to share some thoughts with our audience today. Next slide, please. So here is an overview of the different topics that will be discussed during this workshop. First, we will look at the history of the human right to water and sanitation and explore their normative and procedural content from a human rights-based perspective. We'll then look at the current state of the human rights to water and sanitation globally. And based on those findings, I will explain some of the goals and activities of our organization, Human Right to Water. And this will lead to a general discussion about what can be done to fully realize the human right to water and sanitation with the help of Wasif. Next, please. Next. So in the history of human rights law, the human rights to water and sanitation have only been recently recognized. The first step is to look at the International Bill of Human Rights, which is a collective name for 3 legal documents: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, that sets out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The last 2 documents entered into force in 1976 after a sufficient number of countries ratified them. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights includes 2 articles that recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living and to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Next slide. Amongst the most relevant legal instruments linked to the human right to water and sanitation, one of the pillar documents is General Comment 15, adopted in 2003 at the 29th session of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This document links the right to water to the right to an adequate standard of living. It clarifies the scope and content of the right to water, and it explains what is meant by sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. Paragraph 1 of GC 15 notably stresses that water is a limited natural resource and a public good fundamental for life and health. The human right to water is indispensable for leading a life in human dignity. It is a prerequisite for the realization of other human rights. General Comment 15 also implies that water should be treated as a social and cultural good and not primarily as an economic good. State parties have a constant and continuing duty under the covenant to move as expeditiously and effectively as possible towards the full realization of the right to water. Over the last 18 years, the human rights to water and sanitation have developed from the definition outlined in General Comment 15. Through a series of resolutions at the UN General Assemblies and Human Rights Council in 2010 and 2015, there has been increasing clarity over the meaning and interpretation of these rights. In 2010, through Resolution 64292, the United Nations General Assembly explicitly recognized the human right to water and sanitation, reaffirming that clean drinking water and sanitation are essential for the realization of all human rights. On the other hand, Resolution 70169, adopted in 2015, explicitly recognizes the human right to water and sanitation as two distinct rights. The Sustainable Development Goal targets, on the other hand, on water and sanitation, SDG 6.1 and 6.2, clarify these human rights in terms of simple targets and goals for states to achieve. As with human rights, states make a commitment to achieve the SDGs targets over a reasonable time by the year 2030. Next slide. So what does this mean in terms of state obligations? States have the duty to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights to water and sanitation. States must refrain from interfering directly or indirectly with the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. They must prevent any violation of any individual's rights by any other individuals or non-state actors. They must adopt positive measures to ensure the full realization of the right, and the state is also required to promote those rights by way of education and the dissemination of information. Finally, the state needs to provide those rights through the direct provision of goods and services to people who, through conditions beyond their control, are not able to fulfill their own needs. Next slide. In this legal framework, the duty bearers are the states, the service providers, and all authorities in a position to support human rights realization. The rights holders are all members of society and include everyone, especially the most vulnerable. Next slide. Human rights include an obligation to make progress to the maximum of available resources and do not set a time limit. They oblige all states to commit to progressive realization and provide a legal framework for supporting its achievement through standards and norms from which states can derive their own laws, policies, and regulations to suit. However, this cannot be interpreted as a laissez-passer to defer efforts. Progressive realization implies immediate and long-term obligations and the constant and continuing obligation to make progress to the maximum of available resources. Next. Let's now take a closer look at the content of the human rights to water and sanitation and what it implies for the duty bearers. Next. So there are two sides to the human rights to water and sanitation, including a normative and a procedural content. The normative content provides the so-called ilities that define the criteria linked to the human rights to water and sanitation and the more quantitative aspects, while the procedural side incorporates the human rights-based approach, which can apply to any other human right. Next. Looking at accessibility first, it defines the level of access and identifies who has this access. General Comment 15 states that physical accessibility should be sufficient, safe, and acceptable, and accessible within or in the immediate vicinity of each household, educational institution, or workplace. It is concerned about physical security for vulnerable people, as women, girls. The establishment of SDGs target indicators, as women, girls, and other vulnerable people, such as the elderly and the disabled, that can feel threatened when claiming access. Prior to the establishment of SDG target indicators, the references for these standards are included in Comment 15 and WHO drinking water standards. The norms provide an approximate set of rules that can respect and protect the human rights to water and sanitation. The water needs to be affordable, but not necessarily free. In other words, it should not cost so much that it detracts from realizing other rights, such as to food, education, or health. It needs to be clean and safe and free from contaminants, and it needs to be accessible and provided in a way that respects local culture. Next. The criteria of affordability implies the fact that water and sanitation services must be affordable to all. In order to achieve this, state parties must consider the adoption of low-cost technologies as well as appropriate pricing policies, such as free or low-cost water and income supplements. It is necessary to take into account people's capacity to pay when adopting these measures. Note that informal methods for service provision often mean higher costs for people who can't least afford. GC15 notably stresses that under no circumstance shall an individual be deprived of the minimum essential level of water, which also implies that states need to adopt proper procedures in case of disconnection. Next. According to the UN Development Programme, water costs should never exceed 3% of household income. Next. The criteria of availability implies that water supply for each person must be sufficient and continuous for personal and domestic uses: drinking, personal sanitation, washing of clothes, food preparation, and personal and household hygiene. General Comment 15 does not specify the exact quantity of water required, but refers to the need for conformity with WHO guidelines, which suggest that 50 to 100 liters of water per person per day are required to ensure their most basic needs. In terms of sanitation, there must be a sufficient number of sanitation facilities, toilets, and sewage systems to ensure that all of the needs of each person are met. Here we can see a summary of the WHO guidelines on water availability. Next. The quality criteria implies that water must be safe, therefore free from microorganisms, chemical substances, and radiological hazards that constitute a threat to a person's health. Sanitation facilities must be safe to use and must effectively prevent human, animal, and insect contact with human excreta. These facilities must ensure safety and must protect the health of users and the community. Next. Assessing water quality can be highly complex, as it involves the evaluation of microorganisms' physical and chemical parameters. The WHO and UNICEF are points of reference as they define core parameters for assessing quality, notably through the WHO guidelines for drinking water quality. Next. Finally, the criteria of acceptability has different components. The water supplied must comply with several elements. The odor, taste, color must be accepted by the beneficiaries. Procedural considerations also play a role, such as the behavior of suppliers when providing services. Moreover, notions of culture and gender, to cite a few, must be accounted for. For example, women must feel their privacy and dignity is respected when using toilets, and indigenous communities should be able to use water according to their cultural practices. Next. The challenging part of achieving all these goals and make sure the criteria are respected lies in the implementation of programs and service provision. This is where the procedural principles, also known as cross-cutting human rights criteria, come in. A human rights-based approach is essential to ensure that water and sanitation facilities are available to all on a non-discriminatory basis, and priority must be given to the most marginalized and vulnerable. The key principle here is the participation of the local community, inclusive of women and with representatives from the different vulnerable and marginalized members of society. Participation must be meaningful, be part of the decision-making process, and serve to be more inclusive. One aspect that helps with this is access to information, which is often not made available in a format that can be read or accessed by people in their local language, or for zones without internet, for instance, or for people without the ability to read. States must also promote transparency on budgets and other forms of financing, as well as programs and projects of all actors involved in the water and sanitation sector. Ultimately, states need to be accountable for non-discrimination. If an inclusive and participative process is followed, the end result should be more sustainable, with the support of all kinds of stakeholders and helpful for the environment. As mentioned above, non-discrimination implies that water and sanitation facilities must be available to all on a non-discriminatory basis, and that priority must be given to the most marginalized and vulnerable to forms of exclusion and discrimination. For instance, persons with disabilities, the elderly, indigenous communities, etc. Next. The principles of access to information and transparency imply the right of everyone to seek, receive, and impart information concerning water issues. It involves that individuals must be aware of their rights and also know how to claim them. States must ensure that information relating to standards and progress towards meeting those standards is available and accessible, and that there is transparency when looking at budgets, financing, and the stakeholders involved in relevant projects. Next. The human right to water and sanitation can only be realized through full, free, and meaningful participation in decision-making processes and by the people affected by the decisions. In practice, participation leads to a better implementation of projects, it enhances effectiveness and sustainability, and it offers the possibility of social transformation in the long term. General Comment 15 also states that persons or groups who have been denied the right to water should have access to effective judicial or other appropriate remedies at both national and international levels. National ombudsmen, human rights commissions, and similar institutions should be permitted to address violations of the right. States should be held accountable for meeting their obligations and ensuring that non-state actors, such as service providers, respect their respective obligations. This leads back to the importance of transparency that we mentioned previously. Next. Finally, the principle of sustainability highlights the fact that future generations shall also have the right to water and sanitation. As such, water and sanitation must be provided in a way that respects the environment and ensures a balance of the different dimensions of economic, social, and environmental sustainability, as stated in General Comment 15. Sustainable Development Goal 6 is based on the standards of the human rights to water and sanitation, and it captures most of the criteria of these rights and some of the principles of a human rights-based approach. For example, SDG 6.1 covers accessibility, affordability, water quality, and to some degree acceptability. Universality and equity point towards non-discrimination. Target 6b, on the other hand, suggests that the methodology used to achieve objectives should always be participative. By definition, sustainable development goals or targets are targets, and they are oversimplified to provide for the quantifiable monitoring of standards, to encourage states to achieve measurable outcomes towards these goals. The inclusion of a human rights-based approach and the integration of laws, standards, and processes that support the human rights to water and sanitation are the means to achieving these targets and outcomes. Let's now move on to the third part of this presentation, which will give us a clearer understanding of where we stand in terms of realizing the human rights to water and sanitation. So how are we doing? Before the pandemic, about a third of people did not have access to safely managed drinking water, and 60% lacked access to safely managed sanitation, despite big increases in the last 15 years. About 2/5 of global healthcare facilities did not have soap, nor water or alternatives. 3 billion people still lack basic hand washing at home. There is currently a threat of scarcity for many regions to exacerbate the problem, and severe funding gaps for achieving water and sanitation targets. Worryingly, women and girls continue to be left behind, as 80% of households without water on premises rely on their womenfolk for collection. The joint monitoring program, service ladders, are used to benchmark and compare service levels across countries. Over recent years, these have been updated and expanded to facilitate enhanced global monitoring of drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene. So let's look at the GMP drinking water ladder, which displays different service levels. Safely managed water being the desired objective and surface water being untreated water directly from a river, dam, lake, pond, stream, canal, or irrigation canal. These different levels of services reflect different realities. Safely managed water implies drinking water from an improved water source that is accessible on premises, available when needed, and free from fecal and priority chemical contamination. Basic service level implies access to drinking water, but not necessarily accessible on premises and when needed. Limited access involves collection times which exceed 30 minutes round trip, therefore exceeding the time collection prescribed by the WHO guidelines. Finally, unimproved access involves drinking water from an unprotected dug well or unprotected spring. Next. This map shows the proportion of the population using safely managed drinking water services in 2020. As we can see, there are huge disparities globally, and we can see that in the Central African region, several countries have less than 25% of their population with access to safely managed drinking water. Next. Similarly, the sanitation ladder classifies different levels of services from open defecation to safely managed sanitation. The latter involves the use of improved facilities, toilets that are not shared with other households and where excreta are safely disposed of in situ or removed and treated off-site. Limited sanitation services reflect the use of improved facilities shared between 2 or more households. And unimproved sanitation involves the use of pit latrines without a slab or platform, hanging latrines or bucket latrines. This map shows the proportion of population using safely managed sanitation services in 2020. Again, we can see big disparities, notably the persistent north-south divide. And finally, the hand washing or hygiene ladder distinguished basic service levels from limited service levels and instances where there are no facilities on premises at all. This map shows the proportion of population with basic hygiene services in 2020, and we can see that the African continent remains heavily affected by hygiene issues. So what can we do to fill these gaps? Well, many things. I will now talk about what we do at Human Right to Water and look at some of the activities we have been carrying out to raise awareness about the need to make the human rights to water and sanitation #1 priorities, as well as some of the tools and programs we have been developing in order to help realizing the human rights to water and sanitation. So, Sophie, could you please press play on the little video? Thank you. So amongst our objectives, we would like to ensure that the human rights to water and sanitation are effectively integrated in national legal frameworks, that efficient monitoring and implementing systems are put in place for the realization of the rights to water and sanitation, and that duty holders are aware of their rights and that these are globally recognized and protected. So let's now look at some of our activities to understand how this plays out in practice. We are currently working on several activities that I will be discussing in detail in this section. In recent months, we have notably been working on 2 country programs in Mexico and Kenya to help monitoring the human rights to water and sanitation locally. We've also published a compilation of good practices carried out by national human rights institutions worldwide to help other actors to get inspired and exchange practices. And we have published a manual for development and human rights practitioners on how to adopt a human rights-based approach when implementing development programs. We are also working closely with our country coordinators who are in charge of advocating for and disseminating informative material on the human rights to water and sanitation in their respective countries. My colleague and friend Wasif Bashir Babar is notably part of this program and will be talking about his experience after my presentation. We also conduct active legal research on the rights to water and sanitation in different national legal frameworks. And in terms of visibility and raising awareness, we organize monthly webinars and we are always active on social media. Next. The multiple legal mappings we have conducted have helped us identifying gaps in terms of water and sanitation in law and policy in different countries. A recurring theme was the lack of legal capacity of states to respond to emergency situations, and that is how we developed our resilience tool. This instrument assesses national preparedness for disasters, notably to pandemics and other emergencies, such as climate change-related disasters, by identifying relevant laws and policies that existed or have recently been adopted to respond to this phenomena. By gathering this data, we're able to establish benchmarks and track how states are prepared to face future pandemics, if they have plans or policies that account for the possibility of a pandemic or natural disaster, and that allows the state to adapt to these phenomena. The objective of these efforts is to ensure that during a crisis, authorities maintain the continuity of services, that they promote and facilitate good hygiene practices, that they maximize access to safe sanitation services, that they ensure priority attention to vulnerable populations, that they keep water and sanitation workers safe, that they give civil society its place in fulfilling its responsibility, and that they maintain active monitoring of the rights to water and sanitation. Next. We are currently readapting this tool to make it more climate change focused as part of our project in Lebanon and Algeria with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. This is a project where we're going to assess Algeria and Lebanon's legal framework and the capacity to adapt to climate change. Next, please. Last year, Human Rights to Water embarked on 2 related programs with the Mexican Water Commission and with the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, based on the Leaving No One Behind tool that we developed with the support of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. This tool is available on our website. The goal is to support vulnerable groups in those countries that are being overlooked for water and sanitation supply by developing a monitoring system that is built up around human rights-based indicators. The project seeks to identify the people that are being left behind. The first steps was to identify the geographical area in which the indicators will be developed, since each area has its own characteristics, needs, priority groups, strength, and other elements to make it unique. We then conducted a legal analysis of the applicable water and sanitation frameworks, engaging with local communities to validate the results. Based on the identification of legislative gaps and particular vulnerable populations in terms of access to services, we then developed human rights indicators to track the implementation of these rights in the long term. The use of indicators in the field of human rights is part of a comprehensive and systematic process to implement, monitor, and realize rights. Indicators are a specific and practical tool for promoting the fulfillment of rights and measuring their implementation. The human rights-based approach attaches importance not only to program outcomes, but also to the process by which those outcomes are achieved. Because of this, the development of human rights-based indicator plays a key role because it allows for the evaluation of human rights compliance throughout a whole given program, project, or action, throughout the evaluation of both processes and outcomes. Through our partnership with national authorities, we aim to integrate the structural framework that already exists in local policy with practical solutions for monitoring some of the process and outcome-based indicators. So this is how it looks in practice. Next slide, please. When developing indicators, the first questions to be asked is what needs to be measured? The answer is that we need to measure the enjoyment of the human rights to water and sanitation by the rights holders, capturing a small number of outcomes that can be related to the status of the effective realization of the human rights to water and sanitation. At the same time, progress made by the duty bearer, in other words, the state, in fulfilling its obligations must be assessed. In this way, indicators should be defined and elaborated based on the guiding principles of availability, accessibility, quality, affordability, and acceptability, and on the cross-cutting human rights criteria of non-discrimination, public participation, access to information, transparency, accountability, and sustainability. What the Human Right to Water team does is to translate the meaning of the principles into a limited number of characteristic attributes that facilitate the determination of indicators to monitor the effectiveness of its exercise. So we have three types of indicators. We have structural indicators, which reflect the state commitment to respect human rights standards in taking steps towards the realization of that human right. So an example of a structural indicator can be the ratification or the adoption of a treaty, the express recognition of the human rights to water and sanitation in the Constitution, the adoption of a new water law, of a national plan for water, etc. So in the example given here, we conducted a research in the Marsabit County in Kenya, and the structural indicator was to see if there was a county law that recognized the right to sanitation. Then we have the process indicators that cover all measures, including public programs and specific interventions that the state is willing to take in order to give effect to its intent, commitment to attain outcomes identified with the realization of the human right to water and sanitation. So here, for example, a process indicator could be the percentage of the budget allocated to water and sanitation in the previous financial year. And finally, outcome indicators reflect achievements, individual and collective, that indicate the state of realization of a human right in a given context. So this is more a direct measurement of the realization of the human right, since it consolidates the effects of various underlying processes over time. So here, for example, the percentage of public toilets that are gender specific, because we were focusing on a specific type of vulnerable population in the Marsabit County, which were women, and we were designing indicators to monitor if their rights were effectively respected and implemented. So the idea in the long term would be to systemize the tailoring of indicators to a wide range of countries, working with intergovernmental agencies, for example. Next slide, please. So in terms of visibility, we have been organizing monthly webinars on current issues linked to water and sanitation, and we are always active on social media. Publications, as I mentioned before, are also a good way to raise awareness and disseminate information on the rights to water and sanitation. And finally, Human Right to Water seeks to provide capacity building opportunities, notably through our youth platform and our country coordinators program. Next, please. So last October, we held a webinar on the importance of engaging young people in the dialogue on water and human rights. And since then, the Human Right to Water Youth Platform was launched, and we have started a process led by young people to continue raising awareness about the human rights to water and sanitation and supporting youth-led innovative solutions across the globe. So through our experience based on research and training on the human rights to water and sanitation, we're aiming to share knowledge and strengthen capacities and to provide an added opportunity for youth networks to get in touch, share good practices, and find solutions to some of our shared challenges. We have notably recently launched a series of youth interviews to provide visibility online for our youth partners to describe their activities and good practices in water and sanitation governance. Next. In terms of capacity building, we're conducting country coordinator programs in Costa Rica, Kenya, Pakistan, and South Africa. Thanks to our partners on the ground, we're able to share useful material about the human rights to water and sanitation, which in turn can be disseminated through locally based workshops. Our country coordinators can then act as trainers and form other individuals to disseminate this information. And the idea behind this program is to create a global community of practice and facilitate the exchange of ideas and good practices. And now I would like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Mr. Wasif Bashir Babar. So Wasif is the founder and president of the Pakistan Youth Parliament for Water, and he's a trusted member of Human Right to Water as well. He's also one of our country coordinators in Pakistan, and he's a well-recognized young water and peace leader, youth ambassador, and sustainable development goals advocate. So welcome, Wasif. Thanks for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so very much, my dear friend Emmanuel, for the task and the thought-provoking presentation and historical background of the human rights to water adaptations and the wonderful introduction. Thank you so very much. So I would like to share with all of you that I became member of World Youth Parliament for Water in 2015 during the General Assembly which held in South Korea. And I am so privileged to announce that I worked with two presidents, WYPW, Asma Bashi, and also our last president of World Youth Parliament for Water. Secondly, I am also one of the active member of Human Rights to Water Organization based in Geneva, as already shared with all of you, and also acting as a country program coordinator. I am going to share with all of you the experience which we are facing being a young generation, especially in the South Asia developing regions. Youth is always neglected. I don't know why, but they are always considered as competitors, but they are not, by the way. They are the supporting hand for the senior to achieve the SDGs and all the national and regional goals. And secondly, Pakistan is the most popular country which adopted the clean and green campaign, which is being led by our Excellency President, Prime Minister of Pakistan. We are going to build a green Pakistan and develop the noble example of the fighting against climate change, which is already mentioned in the World Economic Forum. And thirdly, human rights to water and sanitation approach is also very important because this approach is first time in my knowledge adopted by the different organizations. When I used to work with different civil societies, I mentioned human rights based approach, which is the flagship of human rights to water organization, how it include the participation, inclusion, and it ensured the transparency of the local communities, governments, and all the other liabilities of the water and sanitation. My dear friends and colleagues, I would like to share with all of you that when I joined the country coordinator of human rights to water organizations, it was very much heavy task for me first time, but when I started to segregate all the tasks and objectives, I feel that this is the most important thing which the young generation should do at first and foremost priorities based. I started to develop the liaison with different organizations working on water and sanitation in Pakistan. I meet with the high officials of the Human Rights Commission in Pakistan. And then also I would like to mention the 2 or 3 departments. One is the Pakistan Council of Research in Water Resources, which is working very actively on the water and sanitation and its quality assurance. Second one is the Center for Rural Development, which is based in Pakistan and Islamabad. And the third one, the Human Rights Commission in Pakistan. So when we most of the time talk to their high officials, they expressed their intensive interest about organizing some local workshops and trainings for the duty period as well as the rights achievers as well. So second most important thing that is our the country program financial support and the sponsor, which is the Gomal Daman Area Water Partnership. that this organization is the direct people of Global Water Partnership based in Sweden. They joined us in Pakistan to support all kind of, the logistics support, including the financial and all other stuff, to organize the youth-based activities for the human rights and water approach, for awareness raising, capacity building, and advocacy activities in all around the Pakistan. I mean, this is very big achievement in Pakistan when some organization that is local based organization, they committed to support the youth for highlighting and for raising the awareness about the human rights to water and sanitation. Uh, the third most important thing which I would like to mention here, that we submitted our special sessions to organize the International Water Resource Association World Water Congress, which is going to be held in South Korea in next couple of months or 3 months later. This proposal was exclusively accepted by the International Research and the Steering Committee of this Congress. And I am so privileged that I already developed the material to highlight the human rights to water organizations, and especially, which I would like to mention here, the human rights-based approach to water and sanitation during all of our activities in South Korea. And I would like to also express my great thanks to IWRA team for their generous support and guidance, and especially the support of the CEO of Human Rights to Water Organization, Honorable Amanda Lawson. She always keep herself available to support and guide us for the implementation of the human rights to water approach in Pakistan and country program coordinators in Pakistan as well. So this was all about me. Although we have secured the funds, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're a bit over the time. So could you please conclude? And the prayer is starting on the background. We don't really hear you anymore. Well.
Okay, so I would like to over to you because it's Azan here and I will have to keep quiet for a few minutes. So please, you can move forward and I will give my concluding remarks at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Thank you first, Inamol, for this very insightful and detailed presentation. Yeah, it is true that legal definition policies can be unclear for persons, especially with no legal background. And we can say you succeeded to give us an overview of the topic with a youth perspective on the human rights of water and sanitation. I was particularly a big fan of the two case studies you talk about in Mexico and Kenya with vulnerable group left behind, proposing a tailored human rights-based indicator. And I wish you luck, and I hope this indicator will be spread all over the world. You also presented us the activities of human rights to water, which include youth. And on that topic, I would share the same feeling of Wasif, saying that youth, it's also seen as a threat. But I know there are some professionals and mentors in the water sector that are ready to work together in achieving SDG 6 based on really strong intergenerational exchanges. So let's keep hope. And we are here today. So this is a big proof of the efforts that are being made. So now I would like to continue with the question from the panel. I saw that someone asked, I don't know if you had time, Inamol, to read it, because it's actually linked to a comment that this person did before. Wrote before, sorry. So I'll let you the floor to answer it.
Yes, sure. So I read the question and I thought it was an interesting point, right? Because it showed how difficult it is to sometimes find the right balance between all these criteria, and you know that sometimes the access for some can mean less access for others, or affordability for some can mean less quality for others. And always with the human rights-based criteria, of discrimination that needs to be respected. So the question was how, if people can refer to the long question, they can they can know what I'm talking about. Basically, the question said that some people that have a cheap access to water might not feel the obligation to respect that water. They might use a lot of water, and they might contaminate it. And so sometimes for the person asking the question, maybe disconnection was a potential solution, but that would mean that discrimination, right? My answer would be, I mean, I don't have all the solutions, but I think if local communities are involved, like actively involved in the decision making, and they participate, and that they feel that the water system belongs to them in a way, and that the water is something that they must respect for the common good, this kind of phenomenon can be more democratically and inclusively answered. And the thing is that, yes, more participation, more access to information, and because we've been completely disconnected from the fact that humans and water have intimate links, and the thing is that when the only relationship you have with water is a bill at the end of the month, you don't see the usefulness of protecting it, or you don't see the social value to it. And I guess that's where we need to really put efforts on, is on increasing the participation and the ownership of local communities.
Thank you. Well, linked to what you just mentioned, talking about common goods, my question is actually, as an Earth Charter young leader and an Earth advocate, would you think that rights of nature could also be a possible legal tools to defend rivers and oceans or lakes, and recognize them legal personalities, like they're doing in Lac Léman, for example, or other parts of the world? Well, they want to do it, not
Yes,
yet recognized.
definitely. I respect your fight for this matter, and I really am really keen on respecting more the rights of the earth, as we can see in different constitutions in Latin America, where earth is a subject of law. I think realistically today, human rights are the most effective way of protecting the planet, unfortunately, because the planet cannot defend itself. You know, people and communities have the tools to protect what is theirs. And so obviously that I'm all for the recognition of the rights to water, of the rights of earth, and of the rights of water. But it's true that humans will always be the messenger, you know, the channel to the legal remedies. And that is why we have to put a strong emphasis on again, when I say ownership, it's not, we're not owners of water, but at least that we own our water systems, that we are, you know, participating actively in the environmental solutions as a community. And yes.
Thank you for your answer. I will have a look if any other question in the chat. No. Sophie, do you have you seen any question on the live of ISW?
No, maybe some participant wants to raise their hand if they have question that they want to say out loud.
Definitely.
On my side, I do have a question. I was wondering, like, maybe Wasif or Emmanuel, how would you suggest the youth to use the human right to water into their activities in order to work towards the respect of human rights? what? Like, I feel a lot of youth are doing advocacy and underground projects. So I would say, how would we use this new tool as like all the human rights around water to push forward and to make better projects and better advocacy campaigns?
Wasif, you like to answer that question?
Yes, thank you so very much. And according to my personal experience, I think the first and foremost thing is to develop the strategic partnership with the actors, with the duty bearers, like governments and all the other stakeholders. Your connectivity will make you successful in achieving your goals, either you are working on the right or wrong. But main thing, your coordinations, your commitments with the goals, and the continuity of the coordinations and connectivity with the stakeholders. It is very most important because it solve most of the problems which youth is facing nowadays in the world. Like if we develop the strategic partnership with coordinations, it will help us to secure the funding to implement of our projects, as well as it will also help us to provide us a platform where we can raise our voice at high level panels and high level decision making process as well. And last for but not the least is to train the other youth of your peers, because if you are trained and you are not going to train others, it means all the skills which you have, that is very limited. But being a young peoples, we should not be limited. We should work beyond the borders. And we should train the other peoples. We should, I mean, if Amanal is very expert in the human rights to water and the law side, he should train me. And you could imagine how these skills transfer from the Geneva to Pakistan. And if I have something for the developing the strategic partnership, business development, for the securing the fundings, for the writing the proposal, all that stuff, I should train my local youth, my national youth, and also regional and global. So this circle, this chain should not be broken. If we develop this chain, I fully assure and I'm super confident that we can play our role very effectively to achieve the human rights to water and sanitation. Not only this goal, but also all the other SDGs, because Sustainable Development Goal 6 is the backbone of all the other sustainable development goals. This is the most important and most central point of the SDGs. So this is my personal experience. Thank you, sir. Over to you, Emanal.
Thank you so much for your answer, Wasif.
Thank you.
Emmanuel, would you like to add something to
I think
Wasif said? Yeah, it was really hopeful and so true.
I think I couldn't say it better than Wasif, unfortunately. So
yeah, it concludes a lot of things we actually talked about during this session today, this workshop. So I would like to thank you all again, to thank you our speakers. Thank you for listening and joining us today. We will pursue the Actors of Change workshop series with a workshop about water pollution in September, actually. And if everyone agrees, I will wish you all a good day and goodbye. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.